Hello, 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 hello mga kaibigan. Muli ito ang inyong kaibigan si Jeff the Blind Explorer. Sa oras nito, ipagpapatuloy po natin ang pag-upload ng kwento sa mga naging pangulo ng ating Republika ng Pilipinas. Katatapos pa lamang pong mapanood natin ang kasaysayan o mapakinggan natin ang kasaysayan ni former President Emilio Aguinaldo, the first president of the First Republic of the Philippines. So ngayon naman itutuloy po natin ito sa pamamagitan ng pagtampok sa kasaysayan ng dating Pangulong Manuel Luis Quezon. Siya rin ang tinaguriang ama ng wikang Tagalog. So ipagpapatuloy po natin ang series. Sana po ay patuloy niyo po akong suportahan. Hindi po muna ako nagla-live stream ngayon. Gusto ko po munang pakinggan nyo itong ating mga audiobooks. Mas makakatulong din ito para sa paglago ng ating watch hour, syempre. And aside from that, dumadagdag na yung watch hours ko habang kayo'y nanonood. Mas nadadagdagan din mga kaibigan ang inyong kaalaman, or kung alam nyo na po ito dati, at least nare-refresh po ang inyong knowledge. So please support nyo pa rin po si Jeff the Blind Explorer. Ito na po ang ating tampok sa video ito, ang kasaysayan ni Pangulong Manuel Luis Quezon. Jeff the Blind Explorer is your friend.
Manuel L. Quezon was a Filipino statesman, soldier, and politician who served as president of the Commonwealth of the Philippines from 1935 to 1944. He was the first Filipino to head a government of the entire Philippines, as opposed to the government of previous Philippine states, and is considered to have been the second president of the Philippines, after Emilio Aguinaldo (1899–1901). During his presidency, Quezon tackled the problem of landless peasants in the countryside. His other major decisions include the reorganization of the island's military defense, approval of a recommendation for government reorganization, the promotion of settlement and development in Mindanao, dealing with the foreign stranglehold on Philippine trade and commerce, proposals for land reform, and opposing graft and corruption within the government. He established a government in exile in the U.S. with the outbreak of the war and the threat of Japanese invasion. It was during his exile in the U.S. that he died of tuberculosis at Saranac Lake, New York. He was buried in the Arlington National Cemetery until the end of World War II, when his remains were moved to Manila. His final resting place is the Quezon Memorial Circle. In 2015, the board of the International Raoul Wallenberg Foundation approved a posthumously bestowal of the Wallenberg Medal upon President Quezon and to the people of the Philippines for having reached out, between 1937 and 1941, to the victims of the Holocaust. President Benigno Aquino III, and Maria Zenita Quezon Avancenia, who is 94 years old and the daughter of the former president, were duly informed about this. Early life and careers. Quezon was born in Baler in the district of El Principe, now Baler, Aurora. His parents were Lucio Quezon, died 1898, and Maria Dolores Molina, June 7, 1840-1893, both of whom were Chinese mestizo and Spanish mestizo, respectively, with distant ethnic Tagalog origins. His father was a primary grade school teacher from Paco, Manila and a retired sergeant of the Spanish Colonial Army, while his mother was a primary grade school teacher in their hometown. Although both his parents must have contributed to his education, he received most of his primary education from the public school established by the Spanish government in his village, as part of the establishment of the free public education system in the Philippines, as he himself testified during his speech delivered in the House of Representatives of the United States during the discussion of Jones' Bill, in 1914. He later boarded at the Colegio de San Juan de Letran, where he completed secondary school. In 1899, Quezon left his law studies at the University of Santo Tomas to join the independence movement. During the Philippine-American War he was an aide-de-camp to Emilio Aguinaldo. He rose to the rank of major and fought in the Bataan sector. However, after surrendering in 1900, wherein he made his first break in the American press, Quezon returned to the university and passed the bar examinations in 1903, achieving 4th place. He worked for a time as a clerk and surveyor, entering government service as an appointed fiscal treasurer for Mindoro and later Tayabas. He became a councilor and was elected governor of Tayabas in 1906 after a hard-fought election. Congressional career House of Representatives in 1907, he was elected to the First Philippine Assembly, later became the House of Representatives, where he served as Majority Floor Leader and Chairman of the Committee on Rules as well as the Chairman also of the Committee on Appropriations. From 1909 to 1916, he served as one of the Philippines' 2 resident commissioners to the U.S. House of Representatives, lobbying for the passage of the Philippine Autonomy Act or Jones Law. Senate Quezon returned to Manila in 1916 to be elected into the Philippine Senate as senator and later elected by his peers as Senate President, serving continuously until 1935, 19 years, becoming the longest serving. He headed the first independent mission to the U.S. Congress in 1919 and secured the passage of the Tydings-McDuffie Act in 1934. In 1922, Quezon became the leader of the Nacionalista Party alliance. Personal life: Quezon was married to his first cousin, Aurora Aragon Quezon, on December 17, 1918. The couple had 4 children. Maria Aurora, baby, Quezon, 1919-1949, Maria Zenita, Nini, Quezon Avancena, born 1921, Luisa Corazon Paz, Nanita, Quezon, died 1923, and Manuel L. Nanong, Quezon Jr., 1926-1998. His adopted grandson, Manuel L. Manola, Quezon III, born 1970, a prominent writer and current Undersecretary of the Presidential Communications Development and Strategic Planning Office, was named after him. Presidency in 1935, Quezon won the Philippines' first national presidential election under the banner of the Nacionalista Party. He obtained nearly 68% of the vote against his 2 main rivals, Emilio Aguinaldo and Gregorio Aglipay. Quezon was inaugurated in November 1935. He is recognized as the 2nd President of the Philippines. However, in January 2008, House Representative Rodolfo Valencia of Oriental Mindoro filed a bill seeking instead to declare General Miguel Malvar as the 2nd Philippine President, having directly succeeded Aguinaldo in 1901. Government reorganization to meet the demands of the newly established government setup and in compliance with the provisions of the Tydings-McDuffie Act, as well as the requirements of the Constitution, President Quezon, true to his pledge of more government and less politics, initiated a reorganization of the government bodies. To this effect, he established the Government Survey Board to study the existing institutions and in the light of the changed circumstances, make the necessary recommendations. Early results were seen with the revamping of the executive department. Offices and bureaus were either merged with one another or outrightly abolished. Some new ones, however, were created. President Quezon ordered the transfer of the Philippine Constabulary from the Department of Interior to the Department of Finance. Among the changes in the executive departments by way of modification in functions or new responsibilities, were those of the National Defense, Agriculture and Commerce, Public Works and Communications, and Health and Public Welfare. In keeping with other exigencies posed by the Constitution, new offices and boards were created either by executive order or by appropriate legislative action. Among these were the Council of National Defense, the Board of National Relief, the Mindanao and Sulu Commission, and the Civil Service Board of Appeals. Social Justice Program pledged to improve the lot of the Philippine working class and seeking the inspiration from the social doctrines of Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius XI. Aside from the authoritative treatises of the world's leading sociologists, President Quezon started a vigorous program of social justice, which he traduced into reality through appropriate executive measures and legislation obtained from the National Assembly. Thus, a Court of Industrial Relations was established to mediate disputes, under certain conditions, minimizing the inconveniences of the strikes and lockouts. A minimum wage law was enacted, as well as a law providing for an 8-hour workday and a tenancy law for the Filipino farmers. Another measure was the creation of the position of public defender to help poor litigants in their court suits. Commonwealth Act Number 20 authorized Quezon to institute expropriation proceedings and/or acquire large landed estates to resell them at nominal cost and under easy terms to tenants thereon, thus enabling them to possess a lot and a home of their own. It was by virtue of this law that the Buenavista estate was acquired by the Commonwealth government. Quezon also launched a cooperative system of agriculture among the owners of the subdivided estates in order to alleviate their situation and to provide them greater earnings. In all these, Quezon showed an earnest desire to follow the constitutional mandate on the promotion of social justice. Economy. Upon the creation of the Commonwealth, the economic condition of the nation was stable and promising. With foreign trade reaching a peak of 400 million pesos, the upward trend in business was accentuated and assumed the aspect of a boom. Exports crops were generally good and, with the exception of tobacco, they were all in high demand in foreign trade markets. Indeed, the value of the Philippine exports reached an all-high of 320,896,000 pesos, the highest since 1929. On the other hand, government revenues amounted to 76,675,000 pesos in 1936, as compared with the 1935 revenue of 65 million pesos. Even the government companies, with the exception of the Manila Railroad, managed to earn profits. Gold production increased about 37% and iron nearly 100%, while cement production augmented by some 14%. Notwithstanding this prosperous situation, the government had to meet certain economic problems besetting the country. For this purpose, the National Economic Council was created. This body advised the government in economic and financial questions, including promotion of industries, diversification of crops and enterprises, tariffs, taxation, and formulation of an economic program in the preparation for the future independent Republic of the Philippines. Again, a law reorganized the National Development Company. The National Rice and Corn Company, NARIC, was created and was given a capital of 4 million pesos. Upon the recommendation of the National Economic Council, agricultural colonies were established in the country, especially in Coronado, Malig, and other appropriate sites in Mindanao. The government, moreover, offered facilities of every sort to encourage migration and settlement in those places. The Agricultural and Industrial Bank was established to aid small farmers with convenient loans on easy terms. Attention was also devoted to soil survey, as well as to the proper disposition of lands of the public domain. These steps and measures held much promise for improved economic welfare. Agrarian reform. When the Commonwealth government was established, President Quezon implemented the Rice Share Tenancy Act of 1933. The purpose of this act was to regulate the share tenancy contracts by establishing minimum standards. Primarily, the act provided for better tenant-landlord relationship, a 50-50 sharing of the crop, regulation of interest to 10% per agricultural year, and a safeguard against arbitrary dismissal by the landlord. However, because of one major flaw of this law, no petition for the Rice Share Tenancy Act was ever presented. The major flaw of this law was that it could be used only when the majority of municipal councils in a province petitioned for it. Since landowners usually controlled such councils, no province ever asked that the law be applied. Therefore, Quezon ordered that the act be mandatory in all central Luzon provinces. However, contracts were good for only 1 year. By simply refusing to renew their contract, landlords were able to eject tenants. As a result, peasant organizations clamored in vain for a law that would make the contract automatically renewable for as long as the tenants fulfilled their obligations. In 1936, this act was amended to get rid of its loophole, but the landlords made its application relative and not absolute. Consequently, it was never carried out in spite of its good intentions. In fact, by 1939, thousands of peasants in central Luzon were being threatened with wholesale eviction. The desire of Quezon to placate both landlords and tenants pleased neither. By the early 1940s, thousands of tenants in central Luzon were ejected from their farmlands and the rural conflict was more acute than ever. Indeed, during the Commonwealth period, agrarian problems persisted. This motivated the government to incorporate a cardinal principle on social justice in the 1935 Constitution. dictated by the social justice program of the government, expropriation of landed estates and other landholdings commenced. Likewise, the National Land Settlement Administration (NLSA) began an orderly settlement of public agricultural lands. At the outbreak of the Second World War, major settlement areas containing more than 65,000 hectares were already established. Educational reforms. Turning his attention to the matter of education in the country, President Quezon, by virtue of Executive Order Number 19, dated February 19, 1936, created the National Council of Education, with Rafael Palma, former president of the University of the Philippines, as its first chairman. Funds retained from the early approved residence certificate law were devoted to the maintenance of the public schools all over the nation and the opening of many more to meet the needs of the young people. Indeed, by this time there were already 6,511 primary schools, 1,039 intermediate schools, 133 secondary and special schools, and 5 junior colleges. The total number of pupils enrolled was 1,262,353, who were placed under the charge of 28,485 schools teachers. That year's appropriation for public education amounted to 14,566,850 pesos. The private institutions of learning, for their part, accommodated more than 97,000 students, thus considerably aiding the government in solving the annual school crisis. To implement the pertinent constitutional provision, the Office of Adult Education was also created. Women's suffrage. President Quezon initiated women's suffrage in the Philippines during the Commonwealth era. As a result of the prolonged debate between the proponents of women's suffrage and their opponents, the Constitution finally provided that the issue be resolved by the women themselves in a plebiscite. If no less than 300,000 of them were to affirmatively vote in favor of the grant within 2 years, it would be deemed granted the country's women. Complying with this mandate, the government ordered a plebiscite to be held for the purpose on April 3, 1937. Following a rather vigorous campaign, on the day of the plebiscite, the turnout of female voters was impressive. The affirmative votes numbered 447,725, as against 44,307 who opposed the grant. National language. Another constitutional provision to be implemented by President Quezon's administration dealt with the question of the Philippines' national language. Following a year's study, the Institute of the National Language, established in 1936, recommended that Tagalog be adopted as the basis for the national language. The proposal was well received, considering that the director, the first to be appointed, at the time, Jaime C. de Vera, was an ethnic Visayan. On December 1937, Quezon issued a proclamation approving the constitution made by the Institute and declaring that the adoption of the national language would take place 2 years hence. With the presidential approval, the Institute of National Language started to work on a grammar and dictionary of the language. Council of State. In 1938, President Quezon enlarged the composition of the Council of State through Executive Order Number 44. This highest of advisory bodies to the President was henceforth to be composed of the President, the Vice President, Senate President, House Speaker, Senate President pro tempore, House Speaker pro tempore, Majority Floor Leader of both chambers of Congress, former Presidents of the Philippines, and some 3 to 5 prominent citizens. 1938 midterm election. The elections for the Second National Assembly were held on November 8, 1938, under a new law that allowed block voting which favored the governing Nacionalista Party. As expected, all the 98 seats of the National Assembly went to the Nacionalistas. Jose Yulo, who was Quezon's Secretary of Justice from 1934 to 1938, was elected Speaker. The Second National Assembly embarked on passing legislation strengthening the economy. Unfortunately, the cloud of the Second World War loomed over the horizon. Certain laws passed by the First National Assembly were modified or repealed to meet existing realities. A controversial immigration law that set an annual limit of 50 immigrants per country, which affected mostly Chinese and Japanese nationals escaping the Sino-Japanese War, was passed in 1940. Since the law bordered on foreign relations, it required the approval of the U.S. President, which was nevertheless obtained. When the result of the 1939 census was published, the National Assembly updated the apportionment of legislative districts, which became the basis for the 1941 elections. 1939 Plebiscite. On August 7, 1939, the United States Congress enacted a law embodying the recommendations submitted by the Joint Preparatory Commission on Philippine Affairs. Because the new law required an amendment of the ordinance appended to the Constitution, a plebiscite was held on August 24, 1939. The amendment was carried by 1,339,453 votes against 49,633. Third official language. On April 1, 1940, President Quezon officially authorized the printing and publication of the grammar and dictionary prepared by the Institute of the National Language. Likewise, the chief executive decreed that the national language was to be compulsorily taught in all the schools during the forthcoming academic term. For its part, the National Assembly enacted Law No. 570 raising the national language elaborated by the Institute to the status of official language of the Philippines, at par with English and Spanish, effective July 4, 1946, upon the establishment of the Philippine Republic. 1940 plebiscite. Coincident with the local elections for the 1940, another plebiscite was held, this time to ratify the proposed amendments to the Constitution regarding the restoration of the bicameral legislature, the presidential term, which was to be fixed at 4 years with one re-election, and the establishment of an independent commission on elections. With the Nacionalista Party, which had proposed said amendment in their convention, working hard under the leadership of its party president, Speaker Jose Yulo, the amendments were overwhelmingly ratified by the electorate. Speaker Yulo and Assemblyman Dominador Tan traveled to the United States to obtain President Franklin D. Roosevelt's approval, which was given on December 2, 1940. 2 days later, President Quezon proclaimed the amendments. 1941 presidential election. Quezon had originally been barred by the Philippine Constitution from seeking re-election. However, in 1940, constitutional amendments were ratified allowing him to seek re-election for a fresh term ending in 1943. In the 1941 presidential elections, Quezon was re-elected over former Senator Juan Sumulong with nearly 82% of the vote. War Cabinet. 1941-1944. The outbreak of World War II and the Japanese invasion resulted in periodic and drastic changes to the government structure. Executive Order 390, December 22, 1941 abolished the Department of the Interior and established a new line of succession. Executive Order 396, December 24, 1941 further reorganized and grouped the cabinet, with the functions of Secretary of Justice assigned to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Philippines. Jewish refugees. In a notable humanitarian act, Quezon, in cooperation with United States High Commissioner Paul V. McNutt, facilitated the entry into the Philippines of Jewish refugees fleeing fascist regimes in Europe. Quezon was also instrumental in promoting a project to resettle the refugees in Mindanao while taking on critics who were convinced by fascist propaganda that Jewish settlement is a threat to the country. Government in exile. After the Japanese invasion of the Philippines during World War II, he evacuated to Corregidor, where he was formally inaugurated for his second term, then the Visayas and Mindanao, and upon the invitation of the U.S. government, was further evacuated to Australia and then to the United States, where he established the Commonwealth government in exile with headquarters in Washington, D.C. There, he served as a member of the Pacific War Council, signed the Declaration of the United Nations against the Axis powers, and wrote his autobiography, The Good Fight, 1946. To carry on the government duties in exile, President Quezon hired the entire floor of one of the wing of the Shoreham Hotel to accommodate his family and his office. On the other hand, the offices of the government were established at the quarters of the Philippine Resident Commissioner, Joaquin Elizalde. The latter was made a member of President's wartime cabinet. Others likewise appointed were Brigadier General Carlos P. Romulo, as Secretary of the Department of Information and Public Relations, and Jaime Hernandez as Auditor General. On June 2, 1942, President Quezon addressed the United States House of Representatives, impressing upon them the vital necessity of relieving the Philippine front. Before the Senate, later, the Philippine President reiterated the same message and urged the senators to adopt the slogan, "Remember Bataan." Despite his precarious state of health, President Quezon roamed the states to deliver timely and rousing speeches calculated to keep the Philippine War uppermost in the minds of the American nation. Talks of post-war Philippines. Washington, D.C. representatives of 26 United Nations at Flag Day ceremonies in the White House to reaffirm their pact. Seated, left to right, Francisco Castillo Najera, Ambassador of Mexico, President Roosevelt, Manuel Quezon, President of the Philippine Islands, and Secretary of State Cordell Hull. On the occasion of his first birthday celebration in the United States, Manuel Quezon broadcast a radio message to the Philippine residents in Hawaii, who contributed to the celebration by purchasing 4 million pesos worth of World War II bonds. Further showing the Philippine government's cooperation with the war effort, Quezon officially offered the U.S. Army a Philippine Infantry Regiment, which was authorized by the U.S. Department of War to train in California. He also had the Philippine government acquire Elizalde's yacht, which, renamed Baton and totally manned by the Philippine officers and crew, was donated to the United States for use in the war. Early in November 1942, Quezon held conferences with President Roosevelt to work out a plan for the creation of a joint commission to study the economic conditions of post-war Philippines. 18 months later, the United States Congress would pass an act creating the Philippine Rehabilitation Commission as an outcome of such talks between the two presidents. Quezon-Osmeña impasse. By 1943, the Philippine government in exile was faced with a serious crisis. According to the 1935 Constitution, the official term of President Quezon was to expire on December 30, 1943, and Vice President Sergio Osmeña would automatically succeed him in the presidency. This eventuality was brought to the attention of President Quezon by Osmeña himself, who wrote the former to this effect. Aside from replying to this letter informing Vice President Osmeña that it would not be wise and prudent to effect any such change under the circumstances, President Quezon issued a press release along the same line. Osmeña then requested the opinion of U.S. Attorney General Homer Cummings, who upheld Osmeña's view as more in keeping with the law. Quezon, however, remained adamant. He accordingly sought President Roosevelt's decision. The latter chose to remain aloof from the controversy, suggesting instead that the Philippine officials themselves solve the impasse. A cabinet meeting was then convened by President Quezon. Aside from Quezon and Osmeña, others present in this momentous meeting were the resident commissioner Joaquin Elizalde, Brigadier General Carlos P. Romulo, and his cabinet secretaries, Andres Soriano and Jaime Hernandez. Following a spirited discussion, the cabinet supported Elizalde's opinion favoring the decision, and announced his plan to retire in California. After the meeting, however, Vice President Osmeña approached the president and broached his plan to ask the American Congress to suspend the constitutional provisions for presidential succession until after the Philippines should have been liberated. This legal way out was agreeable to President Quezon and the members of his cabinet. Proper steps were taken to carry out the proposal. Sponsored by Senator Tidings and Congressman Bell, the pertinent resolution was unanimously approved by the Senate on a voice vote and passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 181 to 107 on November 10, 1943. Death. Quezon suffered from tuberculosis and spent his last years in hospitals, such as at a Miami Beach Army hospital in April 1944. That summer, he was at a Cure Cottage in Saranac Lake, New York, where he died on August 1, 1944. He was initially buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His body was later carried by the USS Princeton and reinterred in Manila at the Manila North Cemetery on July 17, 1946, before being moved to Quezon City within the monument at the Quezon Memorial Circle on August 19, 1979.